Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 56, Do Natural Laws Lead to Truth? So this is a question you might ask if we try to understand science, if we understand all these scientific laws, these laws of nature, if we formulate them, if we have all these theories which are basically formulated in laws of nature, we call them. If you have all these laws of nature, we really find truth with them? Have we really found truth? Or is there something beyond that? And I think the question is kind of difficult to answer in a yes or no way. You basically would need to say it's yes and no. So it's a part of both things. And I think in the Bible, in scripture, also in theology, basically, you can find an answer to that, or you can find something similar. And if you apply this to this question, you will get a similar result because this belongs together. This is kind of an effect of the principle that I often mention on this podcast of the creation reflecting on the creator, or the creator being reflected in its creation. And what I want to talk about now is first this theological concept, and then I will apply this to this question. So if you know the biblical history, you know there was some fall into sin. That's basically what happening after creation. And then God calls his people, the Jews, and he gives them, after the Exodus, after they return out of Egypt, he gives him this law, this Mosaic law. You notice maybe the 10 Commandments and so on, and this is basically the law the Jews live by still today even. And in the Christian context, this is later, it's not said that this law is bad or in some way abolished, but it's basically pointed to a greater way of achieving righteousness, and it's also stated that righteousness cannot achieved by the law. So this is a lot of what Paul writes about in his letters, and there he writes that the law is good and it's given by God, so it's right, it's good, but it is not able to make just, it's not able to make righteous out of itself. And he states that righteousness can, even before Christ, even before that, righteousness could only be achieved by faith. So it speaks also of Abraham, where it says of him, he believed God and it was accounted as righteousness to him. So he was considered righteous not because he was keeping the law or something, but because he was believing. He believed God. And still, Paul says that the law is true and right and even given by God, but he also says that this law even tempts us to sin. I mean, you might even understand this if you learn something to be right and wrong, then there's some part of us who still wants to do the wrong just because we know it's wrong, just because there's something tempting about doing something where you know it is wrong. So how can we combine that? How can we get an answer of that? Is the law now good or is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? And how can this fit? How can the law be good and right, as Paul says, but still not lead to righteousness, which it should be, which it should achieve, right? So I think to understand this, we need to understand that man was not created to follow simple laws, that basically that's actually what the fall into sin was all about, because the fall into sin was basically by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so which you could basically understand of some kind of law. You have this moral law of what is good, what is evil. To understand this, that's that Adam basically ate of this fruit is considered to be the fall into sin, and therefore you understand that God did not want a man to do this. It means already that this was not a goal of man to live by a law, to live by following a certain law, and therefore there was another idea behind it, and this is pointed out in the Gospels, also in the prophecies towards the Gospel already in the Old Testament, and also later with Paul, because there it speaks of a new creation in Christ. So by the work Christ did on the cross, we can basically be one with Him, become new creations, created in His image, completely new creation. And where it also says that our heart of stone is turned into a heart of flesh that does His will and does not sin, without needing to have a law to know what is sin and what is not sin. So you don't need a law to have this distinction, because as it says in another scripture in the prophets, there it says that He will write His law into our hearts, so that we follow His law basically by heart, so to speak. And this is basically without us having to have this law put out in front of us, and we needing to remember, okay, I need to follow this rule, that rule, this rule, that rule, and then I'm righteous. No, it's put in our hearts, and we behaving like that just out of ourselves, just out of our hearts. And you can see where this is needed also, if you, for example, because with the law, with the given law, the law of Moses, is what there was already the need of an interpretation of this law. So you had this with the teachers, and to Jesus' times it was the Pharisees who really were interpreting the law, and who were telling you how they interpreted what to do, how to deal with a certain issue, or apply a certain law to a certain situation. I mean, you have this, for example, in Judaism, you have this still today, where they try to interpret what you can do on the Sabbath, even in our industrialized society, whether it is okay to turn the electrical light on the Sabbath or not. And there are people who are trying to use this ancient law and trying to interpret it in a way that it makes sense for us in our lives today. But of course, wherever there is an interpretation, there can of course also be a wrong interpretation of this law, and this was also always kind of the issue. And you can see this, for example, in the Gospels with Jesus and also the Sabbath, where He basically was healing on the Sabbath, and the interpreters of the law at this time, which were the Pharisees, they took offense on this, and they basically told him, hey, how can you do this? Isn't the Sabbath holy? Isn't it not allowed to do such things on a Sabbath? And on one place, Jesus basically said, the Sabbath is for the man and not a man for the Sabbath. So He basically showed a way how to correctly interpret this law. So He did not say, oh, this law is nonsensical, no, we do not need to follow it. He completely confirmed that this law is true and right, but He showed the proper way to interpret this, and not by thinking a lot about it, not by doing a lot of scriptural work and so on, but by just basically being it, by knowing this law by heart, because the law of God was written into his heart, and is written then also through him into our hearts. And by receiving this new creation that the Bible speaks about it, in which this is realized, then by faith we can come into that, and then therefore we are justified by faith and not by keeping the law of Moses or some other law, but still, of course, we will keep the law because it's then in our nature. So this doesn't mean you can just break the law and do whatever you will. This is also something that Paul widely rejects, but it's something that you wouldn't do because you are this new creation. Why would you break the law if it's in your heart? So, and I think this is basically, in some sense, what the gospel is all about. Okay, time for a short break. In this break, I just shortly want to mention other products that you can have except for this podcast. So for once, if you want to really learn more about the Sci-Faith podcast, I really recommend to you to get my book, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is available in English as an ebook. You can order it at Amazon. I really encourage you to read it, to get a deeper insight into the ideas behind Sci-Faith, how science and faith can be combined, how they are compatible, and in which way you can find this or combine them to each other. Also, if you like reading novels, especially if you're interested in science fiction, I recommend to you my book Alien Thoughts, which is also about technical topics. Also, these ideas of Sci-Faith are baked into this book and many other ideas. Basically, the whole story of the gospel is told in a way in a science fiction story. So if you are interested in this, I really recommend it to you. This is also available as an ebook, also in English. And I also have, if you are familiar with the German language, I also have a new crime novel. It's called the Odysseus-Liste, where it is about basically a murder that needs to be, or it looks like a suicide, and it needs to be resolved. And there are many also interesting points in it about open source technology and so on. And also it has this idea behind Sci-Faith that you also find in my book, Sci-Faith, the compatibility of science and faith. It's also in there. So I'm always, when I'm writing these books, without this intention of putting these ideas into it, I'm always astonished that later I find that they still are in this, because those are basic principles, and I think it's interesting how they come up basically everywhere in every story and so on. And if you are interested in this, it's a pretty short book. You need to be able to read German, of course. It's only 75 pages or something, so it's a quick read, but it's also really exciting and a really nice story, I think. And this you can also order at Thalia. And I'm looking into, maybe I can do an English version of this. I see what I can do. And if so, then I will announce it as soon as it is possible. Maybe also the books I mentioned right now, except for the last one, they are only available as ebooks. Maybe I will convert them into a print version that you can also get a print version of this. If you would be interested in this, if you say, I really would like to read those books, but I only read print versions, then let me know. Then I know there is a demand for that, and then I will try to put more effort into this endeavor. And if you have any kind of feedback to my books, or want to write a review, or want to get in touch with me, and you can always use the contact form at my webpage, sci-faith.de/en. I really like to hear from you and get any feedback from you, and also ideas for new podcast episodes and so feel free to contact me at any time. Now, to make this bridge back to the question in the beginning, whether natural law or scientific laws of nature can lead to truth, there you have have it in the same way. Nature is described by these natural laws. Yeah, that is true. Of course, we have this natural law. We have, for example, Newton's laws of gravity and Newton's law of mechanics and so on. And this really pretty good, as we have seen by now, describes what occurs in nature. But does this mean that nature itself follows these laws like by the letter, basically? Or is it just in the being of this nature that these laws can be described by it, but there's something deeper to it? And I think this you can see this, for example, sometimes that there's some meme or some videos going around where this is portrayed in some sense, where you think of a time before Newton, and before Newton there was basically no gravity and everything was floating around, and then Newton came up with his theory of gravity, and all of a sudden gravity was there, everything is falling to the ground and moving in the ways Newton postulated them to do. And this is basically what you would imagine if this law itself was what nature is, then as soon as somebody wrote it down and it was postulated, then it would be beholden to nature would be beholden to that law. But before, it would just do whatever it liked. No, it was always doing that. It was already behaving like this. But Newton was finding a law to describe how nature behaved. But it shows the correct order. Nature behaves in the way it behaves, and these laws are ways to describe this behavior, but they are not the behavior or the essence of nature itself, but the essence of it is basically nature, is the created nature of God, how God created it, and we can then describe it using those laws. But also, as with the Sabbath, there is interpretation needed to interpret these laws in the correct way, and there's also gaps that are there still, where these laws cannot describe everything. So you have these interpretations. This is something that I often also talked about in the podcast and also in my book, about that every scientific theory can be interpreted in different ways, and they might be able to reproduce the same scientific results, and therefore you cannot really know which laws would now be the correct one, because there are different interpretations of it. So from there you could not get to the whole truth. But also, I think there is some way where these laws describe parts of the whole thing, but can always only describe parts and never grasp the whole thing, never grasp the whole essence of it. And with our descriptions, we only ever get some part of it. So you can imagine this like the difference between a continuous spectrum and a discrete spectrum. So you have it, for example, you have this in numbers. So if you know about numbers, that there are the rational numbers, which are basically all numbers that you can get by fractions. So of course, numbers 1, 2, 3, the integers are all included in this, because you basically get by fractions of dividing by 0, so, by 1. So if you divide every integer by 1, it will still be the same integer. So basically also kind of a fraction. And then you do all these fractions and so on, and you can get a lot of numbers with that, but there are certain numbers that you won't get with it. So for example, the square root of 2 you cannot get with this with a fraction. The number of pi you cannot get with a fraction. The number of e you cannot get with a fraction, and so on. So these you cannot get this way, and therefore there are small gaps. You can get as close as you like with adding the ever better fractions to your number. Then you can get as close to these numbers as you like, but you cannot get to this number itself. And therefore it is a discrete spectrum. Discrete means it's only in parts, it's not continuous, it's not a flowing thing. But the real numbers, they are different. They include these numbers, and therefore they are a continuous spectrum. So there you can really get to every point on this time, on the numbers. So to every part of this spectrum, you can achieve every part. And this is basically what it's like here too. With these natural laws, you can cover huge aspects of the essence of nature, of what nature itself does, but only to a certain degree. You can get arbitrarily close to the whole description, but you cannot completely grasp it, and there will always be some gap, there will be always something missing. And I think this is also due to the fact that the materialistic world which you or the world of just matter which you describe through science, that this is not all of this world, and that it is also closely connected to the spiritual world, and you cannot completely separate them from each other, and therefore there will always be a missing piece. So as long as you describe nature just out of science, just with scientific laws, you will have these gaps, these missing. Even if you get them as small as possible, there will be still these small gaps where you will not be able to describe the whole truth out of these natural laws. And this is also because of the fact, as I have also several times mentioned on this podcast, that truth itself is not a material thing. It's not a materialistic thing. It has a property that is beyond the material, and therefore to describe it, you need to, of course, go beyond the material and to describe it in full. And therefore you can see by this also that you need to go deeper. You need to grasp it beyond only the material and to get the full idea, to get to the full truth. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.